I started leaving the scraps because I didn't know what else to do with the silence. After Margaret died, the cabin felt too big, the forest too quiet, and every meal I cooked seemed like an apology to no one. So I'd walk to the tree line at dusk with whatever I couldn't finish: bread crusts, apple cores, half a roasted chicken, and set them on that flat stone where the pines grow so thick the light barely reaches the ground. It was just something to do with my hands, a small ritual to fill the hours that grief had hollowed out. The first time the food disappeared, I assumed it was ravens or a black bear fattening up before the snows came. But then I noticed the silence that followed my visits, the way the forest seemed to hold its breath when I approached. No birds called, no branches snapped in the underbrush, just a heaviness in the air, like something vast was paying attention. I told myself I was imagining things, that loneliness plays tricks on a man's mind when he's got nothing but memories and mountains for company. Then came the morning I found the stones. 5 smooth river rocks ranged in a perfect circle round where I'd left the food, each one balanced on its edge in a way that couldn't have happened by accident. The snow round them was disturbed by something I couldn't name, not paw prints, not boot prints, but something else entirely. That's when I understood I wasn't alone anymore. I began studying the arrangements like a man deciphering scripture. Each morning brought new patterned stones stacked in spiraling towers, branches woven into geometries that seemed to shift depending on where I stood, symbols scratched into the bark of ancient cedars that looked almost like writing. The precision haunted me more than the scale of whatever had created them. This wasn't animal instinct or random chance. This was communication, deliberate and patient, from something that understood the language of intention. The tracks appeared after the first heavy snow, and they stopped my heart cold. Each footprint was nearly 18 inches long, pressed deep into the powder with a weight that suggested enormous mass moving with impossible care. But it was the spacing that unsettled me most. The stride was measured, calculated, as if whatever made them had been walking slowly on purpose, wanting to be observed but not confronted. I knelt beside one print and saw where the impression showed 5 distinct toes, almost human but proportioned all wrong, belonging to something that had been walking these mountains since before my ancestors carved their names into Ellis Island logs. That night I watched from the window as the moon rose full and silver. The food I'd left, an entire pot roast with vegetables, still warm, sat untouched on the stone, until the shadows between the trees grew dense and purposeful. Then I saw the eyes, catching the moonlight like amber caught in ice, watching me with an intelligence so profound it felt like being seen through, recognized, understood in ways I'd forgotten were possible. Something vast moved at the edge of perception, and I understood I was being judged worthy of trust. The years folded into each other like pages in a book I couldn't stop reading. What began as simple offerings became elaborate rituals of connection: roasted venison, arranged on wooden platters, fresh bread still steaming in the cold air, jars of honey I'd harvested from hives near the creek. Each morning the food would be gone, and in its place I'd find new arrangements that felt like replies in a conversation beyond words. I started recognizing patterns in the symbols, sensing emotions carved into wood and stone: gratitude, perhaps, or acknowledgement of shared solitude. I caught glimpses that collected in my memory like photographs taken in failing light, a massive silhouette moving between the pines during a winter storm, shoulders broader than any man's, head turning slowly as if listening to frequencies I couldn't hear. The way snow would suddenly stop falling in one spot near the tree line, as if something immense stood there, blocking the sky. Once, during a particularly dark October, I saw a hand of, that's what I could call it, reaching from the shadows to take bread from the offering stone, fingers as long as fence posts, covered in dark hair that seemed to absorb moonlight rather than reflect it. My grief became quieter in those years, transmuted into something I couldn't name. The creature's presence was a weight that somehow made my own burdens lighter, as if loneliness recognized in another soul becomes less isolating. I stopped wondering if I was losing my mind and accepted this communion as the truest thing in my diminished world. Sarah arrived in March, her skepticism filling the cabin like cold air through a cracked window. She spoke carefully, the way people do when they've decided you're fragile, her eyes scanning the journals I'd kept with the clinical concern of someone inventorying evidence of decline. I let her talk, let her theories about isolation and grief-induced delusion wash over me like rain I'd long stopped trying to avoid. But the forest has its own way of bearing witness. The third night, I woke to her, standing at the window, breath fogging the glass, body rigid as iron. She didn't speak when I approached, just pointed with a trembling finger at the handprint pressed against the frost from outside, each finger as long as a ruler, the palm print so massive it covered half the pane. The glass had bowed slightly under the weight, but hadn't broken, as if whatever pressed there had calibrated its strength with impossible precision. Wanting to be seen without causing harm, we stood together in silence as the sound came, that low, mournful howl that rolled down from the high peaks like distant thunder made of sorrow. It wasn't animal or human, but something between, a vocalization that seemed to bypass ears entirely and resonate in the chest cavity, in the hollow places where grief lives. Sarah's hand found mine in the darkness, her fingers cold and gripping tight. When dawn came, the handprint remained, a ghost in melting frost. She never called me senile again, never suggested I leave the mountain, understanding finally that some presences demand acknowledgement beyond the comfortable boundaries of rational thought. I brought Sarah to the study where decades of journals lined the shelves like confessional archives, their spines worn from handling during sleepless nights. Page after page revealed patterns I'd spent years documenting. The creature's appearances clustered around marked calendar dates, each one circled in red ink that now seemed like dried drops of memory. February 9th, the day Elizabeth died, when I first saw its silhouette against the snow. October 23rd, our wedding anniversary, when the stone arrangements appeared in spiraling patterns of mourning. Sarah's fingers traced the entries, her professional composure crumbling as she recognized dates. I'd never shared with her the miscarriage she'd suffered 2 years ago, marked by massive tracks circling her childhood home 3 states away, details I couldn't have known. The creature moved beyond my grief, following invisible threads of human suffering like a moth drawn to flames it could never extinguish, only witness with those ancient, knowing eyes. The journals revealed something more disturbing than presence. They showed intention, intelligence that mapped human crisis with astronomical precision. It appeared when the old rancher down the valley lost his son to war, when the teacher in town discovered her cancer, always watching from distances that suggested not threat but vigil. We weren't being haunted. We were being attended to by something that carried the accumulated weight of regional sorrow, like Atlas shouldering a world made entirely of tears. Sarah looked at me with new understanding, shadowed by horror, realizing my isolation wasn't madness but voluntary service as witness to the witness, the keeper of records documenting a presence that refused to let human suffering go unacknowledged. In these forgotten mountains, the chainsaws violated the morning silence like mechanical screams, and I felt it before I saw it, a tremor in the air that made my sternum ache with sympathetic resonance. The logging crew had arrived at dawn, their equipment tearing into old growth that had stood since before my grandfather's time, each falling tree a severed artery in a forest's body. I stood on my porch with coffee growing cold in my shaking hands, watching the tree line with dread certainty, knowing this destruction would summon something that preferred shadows and silence. Sarah gripped my shoulder, still processing the journals, unaware she was about to witness the transformation of folklore into devastating reality. It emerged at noon, when the sun stood highest, negating every assumption about creatures that hide from light. The loggers' machines died simultaneously, their engines choking into silence as if the forest itself had drawn a final breath. And there it stood at the clearing's edge, 9 feet of scarred muscle and matted fur, its face a topography of ancient suffering. Those eyes held nothing animal. They contained libraries of witness grief, centuries compressed into amber irises that leaked unused tears for sorrows not its own. The loggers scattered like startled birds, their machinery suddenly irrelevant before this embodiment of everything their progress sought to erase. The creature's face bore ritual scars forming symbols I recognized from Elizabeth's indigenous ancestry research, spirals representing eternal cycles, lines marking the paths of human tears. Its posture spoke exhaustion beyond physical, the weariness of something bound to endless observation of species-wide suffering, unable to intervene or retreat. I saw in those intelligent eyes the weight of every grief it had witnessed, including mine, reflected back with unbearable recognition. It looked directly at me, and in that gaze I understood the crushing burden of witnessing without ability to comfort, of carrying human sorrow across generations while remaining forever separate. The symbols carved into its flesh pulsed with recognition, as memories of Elizabeth flooded back, her fingers tracing identical patterns in her grandmother's journals, whispering about the grief keeper who walked between worlds, She had called it Squansits, the ancient witness, a being cursed with empathy so profound it felt every human heartbreak. Within territorial boundaries, the creature's scars weren't wounds, but sacred marks, each one representing a generation's accumulated sorrow it had absorbed and carried into the forest's deepest sanctuaries. I realized with horrifying clarity that it hadn't been visiting me, I had been anchoring it to this world with my grief, binding it to my suffering like chains. Sarah gasped beside me, her anthropology training colliding with inexplicable reality as she recognized the ceremonial markings from her mother's research. The stories said it could only be released through acknowledgement, she whispered, her voice fracturing. The creature's eyes shifted to her, and I saw her stagger under the weight of inherited sorrow, her mother's death, my decades of loneliness, generations of loss compressed into a single devastating glance. It had been waiting all these years for someone to understand its imprisonment. The journals had documented patterns because the creature was bound to patterns, appearing when grief reached critical mass, unable to abandon those drowning in sorrow. Elizabeth had known, had tried to tell me through stories I dismissed as folklore, preparing me for the day I would recognize the truth. The Sasquatch wasn't hiding from humanity. Humanity's relentless suffering had trapped it in an eternal cycle of witnessing and absorbing pain it could never release. Its mournful eyes met mine with desperate plea, and I finally understood. It needed permission to stop carrying our grief. I stepped forward, through the snow, my arthritic hands trembling as I reached toward the creature's towering form. Every scar on its body seemed to writhe with phantom pain, not its own, but mine, Elizabeth's, Sarah's, and countless others who had walked these mountains carrying burdens too heavy for mortal hearts. The Squansits lowered its massive head, and when our eyes locked, I felt 50 years of accumulated grief surge between us like electrical current. It had been drowning in my sorrow, bound to my cabin by invisible threads of loneliness I'd unknowingly woven night after night. "You've carried enough," I whispered, my voice breaking as tears froze on my weathered cheeks. The creature's enormous hand lifted slowly, hovering inches from my chest, and I understood it was asking permission not to harm, but to finally release what it had absorbed from me. Sarah sobbed behind me, her fingers clutching her mother's journal, as she witnessed the impossible truth her academic training could never explain. The ancient witness had been prisoner to our pain, a mortal empath trapped in humanity's endless cycle of loss. I placed my palm against its scarred chest and felt the thunderous heartbeat beneath matted fur. In that touch, I gave what Elizabeth had tried to teach me through stories: acknowledgement, gratitude, and release. The creature's eyes reflected decades of shared grief dissolving like morning mist, and for the first time since my wife's death, I felt the suffocating weight lift from my soul. It wasn't taking my memories, but transforming the poison of unprocessed sorrow into something bearable. The creature stepped backward into the shadow of ancient cedars, its form already dissolving into the fractured light between branches. But before vanishing completely, it reached into the leather pouch hanging from its shoulder, a gesture so human it made my breath catch. With deliberate care, it placed something at the boundary between clearing and forest, where I'd left 10,000 meals across lonely decades. The Squansits met my eyes one final time, and I saw not sadness now, but profound peace. When it disappeared, Sarah and I approached the offering together, our boots crunching through snow that suddenly felt sacred. There, resting on a flat stone, was a cedar carving no larger than my palm, a woman's face rendered with impossible delicacy, her expression captured in that moment between laughter and tears. My legs buckled as recognition struck. Like lightning, Elizabeth's face, carved in the exact style she'd practiced, down to the specific knife marks she'd favored on curved surfaces. "How?" Sarah whispered, but I already understood. The creature had been watching longer than I'd known, observing Elizabeth teach me about these mountains before illness took her. It had witnessed our love, absorbed our shared joy before grief ever arrived. This carving was proof that the ancient witness didn't just collect suffering, it treasured every beautiful moment that made our eventual losses so devastating. I clutched the impossible gift against my heart as fresh snow began falling, each flake a benediction. The creature had returned. What I thought was gone forever, not Elizabeth herself, but the certainty that our love had been real enough to echo through realms beyond human comprehension. I died 3 months later, peacefully in my sleep, with that cedar carving pressed between my palms and Elizabeth's photograph on my chest. Sarah found me at dawn when she arrived with groceries, the cabin filled with inexplicable warmth despite the fire having burned out hours before. Through the frosted window, she saw tracks leading away into the forest, not quite human, not quite animal, circling the cabin like a final vigil. She told me later, at my graveside, that she'd felt a presence standing beside her as she wept, something vast and gentle sharing her grief. She continued the ritual as I'd hoped, leaving meals at the forest edge through seasons that blurred into years. The offerings were always accepted, and occasionally she'd find gifts in return, feathers ranged in meaningful patterns, stones that hummed with strange warmth. Once a lock of my hair she'd placed in my casket, returned and woven with strands of Elizabeth's. Sarah brought her own daughter to the cabin eventually, teaching her the old stories, explaining how some grief is too sacred for words but perfect for silence and patient devotion. The logging company abandoned their operation after equipment malfunctioned repeatedly and workers reported overwhelming sadness they couldn't explain. The forest reclaimed those wounded acres with remarkable speed, as if the land itself was healing. Sarah swears that on winter nights, when her own sorrows grow heavy, she sees a massive silhouette standing at the tree line, those luminous eyes watching with infinite patience, ready to bear witness to whatever pain she needs to release. The Squansets remains in those mountains still, I'm certain, a living repository of human love and loss, choosing invisibility not from fear but from compassion. My death wasn't an ending but a continuation, my grief finally absorbed into something eternal, transformed into the same ancient mercy that now watches over my daughter and granddaughter. We are never truly alone in our suffering. I learned some burdens were always meant to be shared with those patient enough to carry them across lifetimes. In the sacred silence between heartbeats and the endless shadows of old-growth forests where forgotten gods still tend to broken human hearts, what grief would you share with something ancient enough to understand? Subscribe to witness more stories where the impossible becomes undeniable.